Hello. You are listening to the Carroll Connection with your host, Jared Carroll.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Carroll Connection. I'm your host, Jared Carroll, here to bring you guys another great episode. I did want to take a chance to shout out last week's episode 188 with Catherine Tilley. And on that episode, she came on to talk about her craft business, Cool Cat Crafts, and as well as talking about going through most of her life undiagnosed for autism, and then in 2023, where she was diagnosed, and how validating that was for her to receive that diagnosis and for most of her life was labeled maybe weird or quirky or something like that, and to have that validating feeling, to have an explanation for some of the things that she was feeling or going through at that time. It was a really beautiful conversation. If you guys want to check that out, go to thecarolconnection.simplecast.com. Also available Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major listening platforms. If you want to become a guest or return as a guest on the podcast, hit me up on Instagram at Jared M. Carroll or at the Carroll Connection, and we'll set that up. So now that brings me into today's episode, which is a very special one. I know a lot of you guys may have recognized I reference episode 2 a lot, and that was for my grandfather, James Carroll Sr. And that episode, obviously, I talk about it a lot and the meaning of that episode. And now we are filming in the same location that we filmed for his episode, which is really fantastic. And I'm here to bring you guys another great episode for episode 189, bringing in my grandma Susan.
Hi, Jared. So glad to be here with you.
Yes, excited to dive into a lot of great things and talk about your life with you. Just maybe give a little bit of who you are and what you're doing currently.
Okay, basically, I'm a person who likes to make a difference. I've worked throughout my life trying to make the world a little better, one person at a time. And that's what's kind of guided my life. And I've had very fortunate um, experiences with people. I've had lots of opportunities, some of which I made myself, some of which just kind of happened about, like with your grandfather. We kind of met in a um, 50s club playing Shananas. I don't think it's not there anymore, but it was kind of an interesting way to start a relationship. But life has been like that. Some things are planned and some things aren't.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into a lot of different things on this podcast and go into a lot of different places and talk about just a bunch of different things that mean a lot to you and as well as to me. How I start my podcast, for the people that do know, I always start with family dynamic and kind of like the upbringing of how people are, because I always feel like it's important when we're talking about your life story to hit upon this stuff, because this is where I always use this corny cliche of like building a house. Like, the foundation is our family, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, or in between. And it's always important for me as the interviewer, at least, to kind of hear a little bit of that, and obviously as your grandson to get that perspective, because we don't always ask all the time. And this is kind of like a unique opportunity, and also we're documenting obviously a lot of this too, so this is obviously a really cool thing. So if you want to go into a little bit of detail of your family dynamic growing up, and kind of what it was like for you as a kid.
Mhm. Um, my parents moved to Providence when I was about a year and a half old, and we spent a lot of time with extended family. My grandmother came shortly after we moved here. It's my mother's mother. She came and moved in, and we lived near each other. It was a different kind of world then. A lot of the family lived in a similar area. We could walk to each other's houses, and we could interact with each other. My mother was ill a lot during my earlier years, and I had an aunt and an uncle down the street. And so after school, when she was in the hospital or away, I could go down to their house. And it was like, my cousins were like my brothers and sisters. I did have my one brother of my own, um, but I think I was probably more connected with the cousins than I was with my own brother, but because we were so different.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, that's funny you bring that up, because last week's episode we really talked a lot about cousins and like the value of cousins, and how Catherine was talking about she was closer to her cousins, even though she had a lot of brothers and sisters and even step siblings and half siblings, but it was her cousins where it was always like her safe spot.
Mhm.
And even growing up for myself, I referenced that, just like specifically with my cousin Jake and my cousin Dylan and Brittany on my mom's side. We were all around the same age and they went to the same schools as we did, So we spent a lot of time at their house, like whether it's playing sports, video games, swimming, basketball, having the same friend groups, just like the value of what cousins bring. And um, I feel like a little bit in society we've been losing touch with like our family in that aspect, and like you see that these kids don't necessarily even know some of their cousins, and maybe it's not necessarily their fault. Maybe it's just the way that society has gone and the direction that it's gone, and the closeness. We're not as close with people, and internet it brings us closer, but it doesn't at the same time. Where the sense it's like we feel connected to people, but on a personal human level, we're kind of lacking that connection, and I think we really do see that in society, which is interesting. But I thought it was a really cool point that you brought up about cousins, how the closeness that you felt towards them.
Yeah.
If you want to go into with like your mother too, her being sick, but if you want to continue
Yeah.
with what you were
Well, I was going to
thinking.
say too, the difference too, I think today is that we live near each other, and the world is smaller in a sense, even though it's bigger. And people have moved all over the country and out of the country, and so families aren't that connected. There isn't that center of space where you can go there and everybody knows who you are, and most of them are related to you. But with my mom was, sick a lot when I was a child. She had like 57 hospitalizations at Miriam Hospital. She went to hospitals in Boston. And so it was kind of like up and down, but like I never felt unloved. I never felt, ignored because there were other people there all the time. My grandmother on my mother's side was probably the most important person in my life over those years because everything with her was unconditional. She loved me, and I and all of her sisters loved me, and their husbands, because I was the only grandchild. They didn't have children, and so it became a bigger family. So I don't know how to say it, but
Mhm.
basically it was just so many people there to support and to fill the needs.
Yeah, yeah. And so, would you say that like they kind of filled in a little bit of the role where your mom couldn't in times where because she was dealing with illness.
Right, and my father, I mean, even for my father, he had to go to work every day, and he had to come home and deal with the cleaning of the house and the laundry and, making sure we were taken care of and my mother was taken care of, and so his life was very, very stressful too, and so, having those other folks there and having, like, even the neighbors, like, because we lived in tenements, we were up and down those stairs all the time in the different the different floors because those were part of our family, even though they weren't related.
Yeah, how about the relationship with your father? And did it ever, seeing your mom in the hospital and being sick so much when you're young, did that affect your relationship with your dad at that time? Because I would assume that he'd probably have to take a little bit more responsibility in certain aspects since that his wife is sick.
Yeah,
So,
my father and I had a very, I guess I didn't understand my father. My father grew up in a dysfunctional family. He had multiple brothers and sisters. I think he had 8 or 9 brothers or sisters, and his mom had some issues, and she was towards the end. She was bringing up the last of the kids by herself. Way back then, she got divorced, which was very unusual back in those days. And so she and there was a lot of commotion in his house, and what my father needed was peace. He needed a quiet place to come home to and just let go. He worked for his brother in a factory for almost all of his adult life. Um, and he never made any advances there because my uncle would always say, "Well, I can't give you a raise because my partner will think I'm playing favoritism." And I can't. There's no other place for me. I really need you here. And my father was such a good guy, although I didn't recognize it at the time. But he wanted us close. He did not like when we went out with our friends. He did not like, as my mother got times when she was better and she went out with her friends, or there were people coming into the house. The family, mostly from my mother's side, they were there frequently. So it was that kind of a thing where he got a little bit resentful. He wanted a quiet place. He wanted his family all together, and he wanted to hold them close. And so I was an angry teenager, and I kind of rebelled. And I think all of it kind of influenced that. But in high school, I didn't feel like I belonged. Um, I went to classical high school, which at the time was a very high academic standards, and the people that I was friendly with were the ones that were older than I was because I knew them from the neighborhood. And it was a school where, although it was in Providence, it took students from all over the state, which was the only public school that did that. And so there was not, you never had that thing where you went home and then those people were there. So I never really felt like I fit in. I did have my little group of kind of like we were the fringe people, um, and and we found our way, but I did always feel a little bit out of place.
Yeah, with obviously this progression into kind of the teenage years and a little bit of the rebelling, um, with that high school, was there any like hobbies or sports that you had to play or things that you did to like keep you on like tasks and like away from maybe things that would steer you down the wrong paths?
Yeah, well, back then, I mean, like there weren't the organized sports like there are now for
Hmm.
kids. You know, in the neighborhood, we played, some things, archery, and you know, different street games and things of that nature, but not so much. I was more like into the books, reading and doing the books. And as a younger child and as a teenager, um, I kind of went along with what the people wanted to do, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And that didn't change till I went away to college.
Yeah, and you brought up the neighborhood and the community aspect, and I think that's actually another crazy point to hit is like when I think about my neighborhood or I think about people's neighborhoods, and I hear people older than me talk about the way that they grew up and everyone played with the kids in their neighborhood and do that. It doesn't feel like that. It's the same anymore, and I feel like it's like you almost don't even know your neighbors
Mhm.
nowadays. Like I try my best to wave to my neighbors and talk to them when I can, but it's a lot of the time it's surface level. It's never really you don't really know your neighbors a lot of the time these days, and it's for better or for worse. I mean, it is what it is. But could you speak to that and like the sense of like what the neighborhood meant to people back then?
Well, I think that it was where you knew you were always safe. I think that was the biggest thing, that there were people who cared about you. If something happened that was bad, you could run to anybody in the neighborhood and they would take care of you. It wasn't a case where, this is a bad neighbor, this is a good neighbor. These were just all the people that we knew. This was our hive, so to speak, if you want to look at that. And it was we grew up. I never had a car until right before I went to college, and even that was only for a very short period of time. My parents never owned a car, never owned a house. We were poor, and so that came into play. But people took us places when we had to go places. We walked a lot, and we took the bus if there was a bus. So we didn't. My father didn't believe in credit cards. He didn't, they were like unknowns. You didn't spend money you didn't have. So there was a little envelopes with all the money set aside. So each payday, they'd come and take all the dollars and put them in their little envelopes. This went for electricity. This went for things, and that's how all the neighbors were. I mean, because the neighborhood was kind of homogeneous. And one of the things I have to say, you said like it's not like that now in my neighborhood here. I lived here for 10 years and had hardly anything to do with many of the neighbors other than to wave. And then I got invited to a potluck program for women in the neighborhood. And I started to meet people. And then a dinner club where my husband and I both could go. And it's become our village again, and it's like it's very similar to the old neighborhoods in that if somebody's sick, somebody's over there with a meal right away. If somebody needs a ride to the doctor or needs the grocery store, somebody's there. If they're going to the grocery store, they'll call up 3 or 4 people and say, "What do you need? I'm going to the store." So I've kind of found that kind of a neighborhood, and it takes work to recreate it, but it's here and it's nice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Is it requiring the work of the people to actually form that community and form that neighborhood, and that's where I guess the generations coming up is we're not doing that. We're not, and I think that we're seeing that in society where we're that's where it's like lacking is um like almost like the social awkwardness where people don't know how to have conversations with people. People don't aren't maybe as friendly as they should be towards their neighbors or people around them or even strangers where they just they see them as like almost inconveniences in their day. It's like this ideology of almost like selfishness almost where it's like what I'm doing is priority to what everyone else is doing. And you could say social media plays a huge role into that, but it's weird to see where we don't look at us as a collective as people sometimes, and we really just focus on internal stuff, whether it's our own struggles with our family or work, whatever it is. Like we don't think about what our neighbors are going through or what tough times that they're going through, and a lot of time we just don't even ask, which is a
Right,
crazy
right, yeah.
concept that we don't reach out and wonder or ask and support them. Like you're kind of saying that you've been able to create that because it requires work of people, and I mean, quite frankly, people just don't really want to put in that work nowadays. It's almost between the selfishness comes with this little bit of this laziness where it's almost entitlement on some sense where it's like you feel like we're entitled to certain things nowadays compared to where like you were growing up where even now like you were brought up where that work requires you to put stuff in and have those relationships, and relationships are valued and important in society where now it really isn't. It's different. It's just it's very me oriented, and
Mhm.
it's tough to
Yeah,
navigate that
definitely.
now.
Yeah.
And with building off of that, you referenced a lot of reading and stuff of that nature. And would you say maybe being like creative or like reading, was there any writing? Was there crafts? Like, was that more of like your niche growing
You
up?
know, when I was little, I wanted to be a teacher. So the one thing that I had, like, I had a desk, and I had back then books. You didn't see a lot of books in people's homes. Um, I was fortunate that one of my great aunts worked for a publishing company that did mostly academic publications, but they also did some fiction work. And so every once in a while, she would bring me a book, and those were my treasures. I had maybe like 5 or 6 books that were my own. I went to the library a lot, but the 5 or 6 books were my own and treasures. And if you look around my house, there are books everywhere now because that was um, my special place. And it allowed me to go places I could never go.
That's so important. Is we kind of missing that now? And like I've tried as I've gotten older to read more, and I still struggle. I go on periods where I couldn't read for no like
Mhm.
several months. I don't read a book, and it wasn't really until like almost I'd say like 2020, right around when the pandemic was starting to happen, where I started to like actively look for books. A lot of the time, it's like I guess self help books or psychology books or books about the mind. Or I've never been like a fantasy type of story
Mhm.
person. Usually, I'd want to like visually see that in like a movie or a TV show, but like in terms of books, it's usually trying to see what I could like add to my life and sense like that. But I could attest to the point that books are super important in the development of especially young kids. We don't do that. I feel like that's a weird spot nowadays where reading to your children has become almost like less done and more it's give people iPads, give them a fucking thing to distract them, and instead of just like sitting and having that time because it goes maybe to like the selfishness or where the people they feel like they're so busy they don't want to sit with their kid and read a book, or they don't want to deal with it. They just give it tablet and let the kid watch a movie or a YouTube
Or
thing.
even listen to the book, and with the pages turning on I've seen like some of the books for children, and the pages, that they'll read what's on the page, and then they'll turn the page, but they look at the pictures and they talk about the pictures. And yeah, I mean, it is different. It is a different world. There's pros and cons to anything. And I think that I've learned that along the way. But I have a Kindle, but I don't, that's not my primary thing. I use it at night because it's backlit and it's easier for me than putting all the lights on. But I read books that have very little, in my estimation, value, even in terms of imagination and exploration and things of that nature, because that's my mindless activity in that thing. But a real book takes me places. That doesn't.
Yeah, I'm the same way with I have a Kindle Fire. I really don't use it. I don't really like it. Like there's something to turning the pages of an actual book.
Mhm.
Like it just feels more accomplishing to like as you turn in the pages to see how much you have to go. And obviously there's like you said pros and cons. Like there's even pros and cons to the Kindle where it's like backlit and stuff like that where it's very beneficial. But when you're actually holding the book and able to turn the pages and like see it and feel it, and I've even just kind of shout out to my girlfriend. She's brought me to more like thrift stores and bookstores, and like just like there is like an energy to those places where
Mhm.
like even from you get to like the thrift more of the thrift stores and the thrift bookstores where it's a lot of them are donated and stuff like that. Like there's energy to those books aside from the actual book. The people that I've read, the people that I've touched it, the stories that are probably related to that book. How many times maybe that book's been to a beach or a river and somewhere quiet and someone's reading in the woods or in their home, and like there's stories to the books aside from the actual story, which is a unique thing with reading. But I want to keep progressing with this because we have obviously so much
Yeah.
to touch on. I wanted to start diving into because we're going to get to some really good stuff here. Talk to me a little bit about that kind of post high school. Like, did you go to college? Did you not go to college? What was college like back then? Because now it's a little different, but college is still like almost like an important thing for kids. It's pushed on kids a little bit. So, what was it like for you back then?
Okay, well, in terms of like the high school that I went to,
Hmm.
it was very academically oriented. It was classical. Students from all over the state came to the school. It was a very small school, and there weren't. I mean, we didn't have sports teams. We didn't have any of that. We had to go to another school to take gym, and so it drove me in a direction that I probably would have gone to anyway. I think I may have mentioned as a child, I wanted to be a teacher. And so it kind of fit in with all of that. I was a good student. Um, I liked to read, and I liked, so all of that helped to support those years. I felt a little bit of a loner or like kind of an outcast, but I don't know that other people saw me that way. But that was my own internal feelings and kind of like I really didn't belong. But then when I went to college, it like was amazing. I went to school in New York. Um, I went to Long Island University, but I went to the Brooklyn campus, which was in the middle of a city. Um, and it was in what our classes were held in what was formerly a factory building. We were in, there was one dorm. There were probably 20,000 students that went to that school. Um, but the dorm students, there were only, probably, I don't know, like it was 14 floors, 16 floors to the building. And that's where most of my connections were with the people that I was living with in the dorm. But it was a very progressive school in the sense that because there was only one dorm, the first two or three floors were offices and classrooms. The next 7 floors were apartments. Um, and they were co-ed floors. This is back in 1966. Um, and then there were 3 floors of the boys and then 4 floors of the women. Now, the women's floors all had alarms and everything like that. So if the guys tried to sneak up, the alarms would go off. Um, but it exposed me to a lot of different people, a lot of, and to a lot of, it was the 60s. There were a lot of things going on in the 60s. I dabbled with drugs. I dabbled, with kind of alternate living arrangements. And I went there thinking I was going to be a teacher. That's what I wanted to do. When I got there, they diverted me to other majors, and I wasn't happy with that. But then I took a psychology class, and by the end of that class, I knew, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to major in. Um, and and that's what I did. I took a lot of psychology classes. I took philosophy classes because that fed into the other parts of it. Um, I worked very actively with protest groups back then in the 60s, for all kinds of things. And I can always remember the school raised tuition, and they were raising tuition. And so the students put together a protest. And as part of it, we went into the administration buildings and we wouldn't let anybody get on the elevators, or if they got through the doors, they couldn't get on the elevators, they couldn't get to their offices. We blocked the corridors and all that kind of thing. And they waited a couple of days and let us burn out our energy. And then I got called to um, the president's office, and he called me in and he said, "I don't understand." I was a full scholarship student. Not only did I get my tuition paid for, but it paid for most of my room and board. I think I paid very, very little. And he said to me, "You don't pay tuition. Why are you here doing this?" And so we talked about like the principle and everything, and I did not get in trouble for it, which was because I we talked about why I was there, and he really listened, and he understood that I was looking at fairness. And and from there, then I got involved in a lot of against the war, and about the same things we're dealing with today. Issues around gender, issues around people of color and how they're struggling. And so I was involved with a whole bunch of groups like that. The other thing about my college was that it was probably one of the only, or one of the few colleges that had students with disabilities at it. And at the time, it didn't, I was like, that had no bearing on me, I thought. Um, but later in life, that's what my career was about. My career was as a counselor to people with disabilities, trying to help them to determine what they wanted to do with their lives and get them into vocational um, opportunities. And so it's like all these things that just happen, and you think, okay, that's just passing, that's just passing, really do make a difference. They do play, they have a role in if you listen.
Yeah, do you think the times that you were kind of growing up in, especially at college, really shaped the direction of your career, like you're saying right there? And I don't know if it's around that time period. I know people are probably gonna who listen have even asked about like the Woodstock experience. Was
Yeah.
that around that time period as
Oh
well?
yes, it was, and I was there. I went to Woodstock, and it was an interesting experience, but it was also a very frustrating experience. And of course, there was, the music was great. People, most of the people were great, but um, my roommate and I were staying with a bunch of guys that we knew in a cabin there, and one of the guys had a bad trip and decided that she needed to die. My roommate needed to die, and so he was determined to kill her. So we had to sneak out and run in the woods and, hide and all of these kinds of things that were like, oh my goodness. So I think there's good and there's bad to any experience. I think it's looking at, finding the what we remember most, I think, as we get older or as time passes is the better things, not those little things. But that was so scary to me for us to have to like just lay in the woods kind of thing, waiting till the other guys could get him some help because he was truly, truly determined to do that. But yeah, it was a time. I mean, it was a time of free love. It was a lot of drugs, but the drugs weren't the way they were now. People, I think, they weren't as well. I know that they were there. Hardcore drugs were there, but they weren't. It wasn't within my experience, and I think that. I learned a lot from that too. It's like, I didn't like to be out of control. So that was, I did things by exploration, and that's how I learned. I learned by experiences.
Yeah, it seems like now, to even build off a little bit of that, things are always like to the extreme almost the way things are. Like even if you've referenced like the drugs or the alcohol, or even if you're going down to like the social issues, everything is like goes to the extreme with things, and everyone goes like crazy with uncertain issues. Whether if you go into drugs, you go into fentanyl stuff, and everything is polarized on the internet. If you think back to even just 2020 with a lot of those BLM protests and the situation, everything that was happening then, it's almost like in some ways history does repeat itself, but in
Mhm.
different ways, where we're still battling a lot of these issues, but it's like I said, in different ways. And it's interesting to just hear how you grew up in the time that you were in, and to hear you even talk about how similar it is to now, where we think that things are so different, but you could still pick things and see the same reoccurring issues, and where people are missing certain aspects of life. And just to grow up during that time was probably so like fundamentally like, I don't know what the word I'm thinking is. Like I guess adding to your growth, because like all the different things you're learning, things for the new time, and even dealing a lot of like psychedelics and stuff like that can shape the way that you look at things. Did that have any influence on like the psychology aspect of things? Did you ever look at it like that? Because I know the way we look at like psychedelics now, people are super into that with spirituality and psychology
Mhm.
and the way it works with the mind. Was it like that back then? Did it have any impact?
I don't think that, well, I think that it was this, I mean, it was the same course. I don't think that that influenced me in terms of the direction that I took. I loved psychology. I loved learning about the mind. I had started using drugs when I was here in high school,
Hmm.
just marijuana. And then when I went to college, I found some I liked better. I did like LSD and I did like mushrooms and that kind of stuff. But my friends were very careful to watch me and to at some point to say, "Hey, you're getting carried away with here. You got to stop,"
Hmm.
and then stopped. And I mean, so there was that too. And I think the whole thing of trust came into to being because I always remember that my roommate and I went out after having had some drugs, and we went. It was like the middle of the night. We went to a playground. We were in Brooklyn. There was a park across the street from where we were living, and we went in the middle of the night into the park. Two young women, you know, didn't think anything. Well, we weren't thinking about anything, and then there were gangs in the area, and a bunch of guys came by from one of the gangs and they circled us and we started talking to them. And what happened was that um, I think not showing fear really helped us in terms of getting out of that experience. And afterwards, those guys kind of looked out for us. I had an experience coming off the subway one night where somebody was following me. It was really late at night, and it was like, I usually stayed away from those guys, the gangs that were in that area. And I didn't know what to do because I knew this guy, and now I had to walk down a lot of streets by the park. And he had changed trains with me. He had done all this kind of stuff, so I knew he was following me. And I finally just walked up to them and said, "Look, I'm in trouble. This guy is following me and I need someone to walk me home." And they walked me home. Two guys walked me home. The rest of them went to deal with him. I don't know what they did, and I don't care to know what they did. But basically, they took care of me, and so that was two experiences I had with groups that people would ordinarily say, "Stay away from them. Don't go near them. That's only trouble." And it wasn't. It was like a matter of I showed them respect, and that I trusted them, and they came to my assistance. And then from then on, like every time I went by, "Do you need somebody to walk you home? Are you okay? If you have any trouble, come and see us." So those kinds of things happened. And I mean, I think that's part of how I learned to find the kernel of good that's in every single person that I deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it even goes back to like forming the relationships and actually just like talking to them.
Mhm.
Like, because obviously the fear of being in the park with them and at the time and all the circumstances is like valid. But then when you actually talk to them and not show the fear and stand up for yourself to show that you're strong and you're not afraid of the situation, even though you might be, allows the relationship to form. And then obviously in a situation like that, they could look out for you and like be there. And on some level it's a form of respect for both
Mhm.
parties to show the proper respects and to know that neither one is trying to harm the other, and then that allows the relationship to form and a level of trust to build. And I think that goes to the point of just like the lacking of relationships or forming of relationships nowadays, where people don't do that. They just naturally will avoid those situations to not allow that to like happen to them.
Yeah.
So it's a good point to hit on, and it's interesting to hear that experience. As we're going through the steps here, I want to start diving into you getting into the field of psychology
Mhm.
and what that was like for you, and obviously at that time how things were and how it went with your career. Just talk to me a little bit about that.
When I was graduating from college, I started looking for a job, of course, and I was getting my degree in psychology. Of course, my last year of college coincided with Kent State, so all the colleges got closed down. So um, it was a little different in terms of getting grades and getting, the background information you need for a little while. But basically, I went on interviews and came across so much discrimination because I was a woman, discrimination because I was Jewish, um, and it was surprising because I hadn't really expected that so much, and maybe I was naive at the time. But basically, I mean, I remember I went on an interview. I wanted to go to graduate school. And I went on an interview, and the guys, graduate school at that time, there were only like 6 or 8 slots in any graduate program. And the gentleman that was interviewing me said, "Why would I accept you as a woman rather than a guy when you're probably going to get pregnant sometime through this program?" And I looked at him and I said, "I can guarantee that I am not going to get pregnant during this thing." And he said, "How can you make that kind of a guarantee?" And I said, "Because I'm already pregnant." And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, okay. I think I have enough information and let me go." But it's like, how do you answer a question like that? And it's like, and it was, those are the kinds of things that happened. Came across that discrimination a number of times. And so when I left, I had my children. I was pregnant at the time. And so I had my son. And after a while, it got very frightening in New York because I had to actually chain up the baby carriage if I went into a store. Who would steal a baby carriage? That's what I kept saying, is who would do this? But I became afraid. And once I became afraid, I couldn't live in New York anymore. And so I came back here to home. And again, I couldn't find a job in that field. And so I put in to take state tests. And in the meantime, I went to work in retail and worked in retail for a couple of years. It was really loving it and enjoying it because it fed into my creativity and to dealing with people and all of that kind of thing. Those skills that I learned helped in terms of making sales. But I did end up going to work for the state as a rehabilitation counselor, vocational rehabilitation counselor, working with people with disabilities to help them to either return to or to enter the field of work. And so worked with them to adjust to their disability because some of them were born with disabilities, but many of them developed disabilities later in life. And so helping them to adjust to their disability, or counseling them around their interests and their things that they wanted to do, and to get around this thing of the disability. Because I'm disabled, I can't do anything. People with disabilities can do just about anything if they set their minds to it. Maybe they can't do it the same way we do it, but they can do it. And that's where, like you talked about technology and computers and all of that kind of thing, that really was a help to people with disabilities. People who couldn't see could now read. You could put a piece of paper under the machine and the machine would read it to you. Um, and so I got into that, and I stayed there for almost 30 years, working with people with disabilities, and loved every minute of it. But going back to those things I wanted to do when I was a child, also wanted to be a teacher. And after about 20 years of being a counselor, I got an opportunity to do some training for state employees, and I did some of that. And then I got an opportunity. My own son was going to college. I needed more money, and one of the universities offered me a job teaching rehabilitation counseling. And so I got to live that dream too. It was kind of like this was a little different. And I always thought that I kind of just fell into this thing with disabilities because there were people at my school. But then when I went back and looked at it, one of my grandfathers had was blind. I didn't know it until I was shortly out of college. Um, I had another my grandfather, one of my other grandfather had was totally disabled. Who was in a hospital for many years. As part of my training when I worked for the state, I got to meet young men who were living in iron lungs. And so it was like all of this thing, it was accidental, but it wasn't an accident. There were things in my life that brought me there. And so I did that for many years and found it very fulfilling. Even after, but there were other things I wanted to do with my life. And when I was a teenager, I talked about wanting to have a bookstore. I talked about wanting to have a card shop because these are the things that made me feel good. So after I retired from the state, actually before I retired for the state, I spent 2 years exploring what I was going to do with the rest of my life because it couldn't be the end. Um, and I wasn't wealthy enough to be able to do, travel all the time and do those kinds of things. So I went to some classes and learned about going into business for myself, and I explored all the things. I had been doing some traveling as part of a little bit part of my job and a little bit part of the associations for rehabilitation councils that I got involved in. And so I got to travel parts of the country, and I always used to love going through the gift shops. And so even before I retired, 6 months before I retired, I, I, um, I opened a gift shop. And as part of that gift shop, now it was only going to do pottery and glass, but then it was like, okay, and that was the only reason I could do that because I was still working for the state and I needed that for the revenue was your grandfather. He supported me in this undertaking. And for the first 6 months, he he went in and worked in that gift shop on the days I was working for the state, so that I could have my dream and get it started. And then when I retired, it was right there ready for me. And so for 18 years, I had my own gift shop. It was all handmade American craft. I worked directly with artists, many from Rhode Island, but all over the country because that's what I was doing. What I had done is when I traveled, I always went into artist supported gift shops and bought handmade items. And I didn't have any more room in my house. So I got the store and I had plenty of room to keep doing this kind of thing. And I've met the most wonderful people through that. And it's been it was a it, I brought book section in and I brought a card section in so that when I look back, um, all the things that I wanted to do across my younger life, I've done. The other one is travel, and my goal is still to go to all 50 states, and I've down to about 13 or 14. And although I had a hiatus since your grandfather died of almost like 3.5 years, I am now in September going to take my first trip without him. I'm going to the national parks, and I'm going to go to 3 more states. I'm going to go to Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota.
That's super exciting. Yeah.
That's super exciting.
To be able to do all these different things and check off all these different things of like life goals and life dreams must be super rewarding to do that, and to even go off of the owning the gift shop, like because when on episode 2 we talked a lot about um what that meant to him, what that meant to you, and like the value of like owning that and supporting local artists, and to hear the backstory of kind of like your point of view, because obviously you were really the driver with the business, and it's your business, to hear that point of view of like going to all the different places and seeing that and enjoying that for yourself, to wanting to bring that here and do it your way.
Yeah.
Like, what did it mean to you to be able to support so many local artists and to show their artwork?
Well, I think the biggest amazing thing was that your grandfather was just doing me a favor and came to fall in love with it. So it wasn't anymore mine; it was ours. And what I started out, because of what I did as a vocational counselor, they were people I came across that were very creative, and that's what um, I helped them to follow their heart and follow their dreams to be what they wanted to be. And so I encouraged them and I helped them to become an artist that was producing things and being paid for what they produced. And so that's where I started out. I was going to bring in folks with disabilities and do it with that. But it was so good. Again, like I made a difference in the lives of the people that I worked with in terms of the vocational counseling. With the artists, I also made a difference because many of the artists that I dealt with had never ever shown their work outside of family and friends. And when I would find them or somebody would tell me about them, I'd go and meet them and just like encourage them and bring them into the shop and say, let's just try it. Let's just bring your stuff in for 30 days and see what happens. And I did that, and it was just wonderful to see them grow and to see my business grow as a result of that. I think that people need to um, take a chance. I think you've said that many times, take a chance. I think that's what your grandfather said. You have to take a chance. You have to look at what has meaning to you and let that drive your life as opposed to making money or getting ahead or this whole rat race kind of thing. I was like, oh, I have to be this kind of. What is it that's going to bring you joy? I was fortunate that I could get a job that I loved, and that's what I did. And anytime I thought about leaving my job, my father, who was kind of like, he would say to me, "Oh no, you can't leave that job. That job, that's a steady job. It's never going to go away. That's your comfort. You can do other things besides that, but you can't leave that job." And it was true because that job gave me the funds to be able to do what I wanted to do. And I would and the truth is that I was doing what I wanted to do with that job too. So it was kind of a both thing, my dreams. But at the discovery that whole thing of like when I was in the 60s wanting to make a difference in the world, coming to learn that you did it one person at a time. And I think that's what I did, both in the job and helping folks find jobs or find or decide that they didn't even want to work, which was perfectly fine. You don't have to. Um, but also to the work, the creativity, fostering that creativity. If you look around my house, there's artwork everywhere. I've got paintings sometimes piled up against the wall, and I move one from the front to the back just because I have so much stuff in here. But it's all things that spoke to my heart. And I think that that's really important. I just encourage people to, like, sometimes you have to do a job just to do a job to get the money to live. But you also have to listen to your heart and do what you want to do. And finding a way to do that is good. Um, since your grandfather died, and I kept the shop open for a couple of years afterwards, but it became too much. It wasn't the same. COVID certainly destroyed the business. Um, and he was diagnosed with cancer while that during that time, and it was just too hard, and it wasn't coming back. And I never did it for the money because there was no money in it for me, but it was to encourage other people to have opportunities and all. So I think that there came a time when I said, you know what, this isn't bringing me joy anymore. And if it's not going to bring me joy, what's the point? and I stopped. And I'll be honest, I laid on the couch. I mean, grief. Once my husband died, grief is something that we don't prepare our folks for in this world. I mean, especially in this country, we don't talk about death. We don't talk about grieving. Um, we don't talk about loss. We kind of after think about how many days you get off for if your husband dies from work. 3 days, 5 days. How is that enough for you to recover from such a loss? And our society has not grown to address that. And so I spent a couple of years kind of pretty much on the couch if I wasn't, at the store, in front of the TV. I couldn't tell you what I was watching because it was just noise. And I didn't go out very much. And then I saw a grief counselor, and that made a difference in my life. And I joined a grief group. That made a difference in my life because I was put together with people who understood. And it gave me an opportunity to look at the fact that grief is never going to leave me. It's a part of my life. I made friends with grief, but it's not. It's become softer over time, and I focus on um, the good things that are happening, and not just the bad thing that happened when your grandfather died. For a long time, that was all that was happening. And now I do volunteer work for hospice, and I think it has saved me, and it has given me the strength to help other people again, which is what I think was in my nature and where my roots are.
Yeah, I think definitely being able to give back to people in that hospice situation get you moving, get you
Mhm.
helping again, and get you like out of the routine of grief. Because grief can keep you in a routine that's ultimately, in the end, cannot be healthy. But it's also somewhat healthy to sit there and deal with grief head on. Because if you don't process it and acknowledge that it's going to be there, there's nothing you could do that's going to take that away. And learning how to manage that aspect of life because it's inevitable. Like I remember on that episode, and obviously it's we're several years from that now,
Mhm.
doing this. Um, just how at peace he was with death in that interview, and you rarely get to talk to people in that space, and and especially to get an interview out of that, and to listen to them speak on it. And you referenced to take a chance. I mean, I have it tattooed
Yeah.
on me. I have a signature, and I always reference it in several episodes because it is true. Like it's the willingness to try because you don't want to live with regrets. And he spoke about that and the regrets of not doing certain things in his life, but being willing to take a lot of chances, especially once you entered his life, to be willing to get on the horse again, to willing to try again, to willing to improve and grow. And there's no deadline for that.
Mhm.
Like at no point in your life should you stop growing. There's always chance to keep growing, no
Always.
matter like whether you're young kid playing in t-ball and trying to get better at t-ball, or you're later in life and your partner might have passed, you still can grow and get better. There's
Mhm.
still things to continue to do, and you're here for a reason. And I think on more people need to come to peace with that, with the fact that we do eventually pass away at the end of this life, and sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's unfortunately in the beginning for some people. But acknowledging this is a part of life, people are going to lose people, and we have to be respectful to those people. And you mentioned bereavement and stuff, and um, you see that all the time in the workplace where someone loses someone like really close to them, and like how are they supposed to live life normally, like when something so fundamental to their life and their being is taken out of it. Like it's weird when we don't talk about this, we don't acknowledge death for what it is, and actually ask people, because I think maybe some of us do know like they're not okay, but we need to still ask them and get into those spaces with them. And we don't need, all of us aren't therapists, all of us don't have a psychology degree, but still getting in that space with them when they need that. And because people don't always reach out to people who are grieving, they don't always check in because they don't want to bother them, they want to give them their space. And I don't think that is the best mindset, because a lot of this time those people want people around them to talk about whether it's memories of that person, what they're feeling about missing that person, loving that person. Just they want to express what they're feeling, and sometimes the best way to do that is with family and friends, not a therapist all the time. So, and it goes on to the family and friends of that person to reach out to those people and have those conversations because grief is a powerful thing, and like you said, we don't really talk about it enough in society. So, um, I'm glad that you brought that up because people are afraid to kind of talk about that. And going into this interview, people, if someone else was sitting in my seat, might be afraid to ask you, like, what were you feeling through the months after he passed? Like, people might be afraid to ask
Hmm.
that, but I've learned through interviews and through conversations that you have to ask the question, even if it's uncomfortable for you as the person to ask it, because you don't know how comfortable they are with answering it, but you create the space for them to answer the question, or you create the space for them before asking the question. It's a build up towards that. So to go into it, could you speak on the relationship that you had with my grandfather and like what that meant to you, and then obviously maybe getting more into a little bit more of the grief stuff, but I really
Yeah.
want to talk about like the positive
Yes.
relationships
Yeah.
before the grief
Yeah.
and like what that meant for you at that point in your life to form that relationship with him, and eventually obviously you create the business and everything after that as well.
Yeah. I think that I always had this inkling, like, as as a young adult, that I was going to die at 37, and it was it was just this weird thing that I kind of like pushed it back, back in my mind and all that kind of thing. But when I turned 37, my life my life as I knew it changed. I ended up separating from my husband, getting divorced. We had two children. Um, and so kind of like that again, another loss that people don't talk about a whole lot. But that's kind of that the death of a marriage is also something that you have to grieve and get through. And so it was like about a year afterwards that a coworker had gotten a promotion. We went to dinner afterwards. I said, "Why don't we go to Shaboom's? We're in Providence. We should go to Shaboom's." So we stopped at Shaboom's to have a drink, one drink, and that's where I met your grandfather. He was dancing with my friend. And then at the end, towards the end, he decided that he wanted to get to know me. And so we talked and everything, and he asked for my number, and I gave him my work number. I did not give him my personal number. I just, and that night I had a medical emergency, and I was out of my office for well over 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And he kept calling. He called, and I was not there. When is she coming back? We don't know. All this kind of stuff. And he kept on calling. And then when I finally came back, I didn't get messages back then. We didn't have that kind of capability. Basically, it was on the phone at work. The secretary took the message and she put it on a piece of paper. It was on my desk or in my cubby hole. And so we did get together, and we went for drinks, but separately, um, and we spent a couple of hours talking. And I was dating someone at the time. I came back the next night. That person I was dating came over, and I said to him, "I have to break up with you." And he looked at me, and go, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "I met somebody, and I think there's a future there." And he looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, you have to leave now." And that was the beginning of the best years of my life, apart from my children and all, um, because he was um, I guess he was my person. He was the person I was meant to be with, and he had 3 children. He'd been recently divorced. I had my two, and it was an interesting coming together, trying to meld the families a little bit and not. And um, we we had some kinds of ups and downs, particularly with the kids, because the kids, kids form opinions. Auntie Tracy. I was like, I love her. She's the one I'm closest with, of the three children that I was gifted with by your grandfather, and but we had a stormy beginning, but we fought through it, and and we came to a wonderful place, and I always remember Tracy dropped out of school, and Jim and I were both talking to her about going back to school. And I turned around to Jim and I said, "She dropped out of school too. Why are you saying these things to her?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "Why don't you both go back to school? Go back to the adult education program and get your degrees." And he looked at me and he goes, "Oh, all right." And so the two of them went together and they got the degrees together. Um, and then it was kind of like with my background, finding helping Tracy to find a job that would give her um the joy of being, which was, and she found it. She worked in a daycare as a teacher. She's a teacher today, and so proud of her because she's one of the best teachers around. But it's your father and I just were like melded. I mean, we were supportive of all of our children, of all of our grandchildren. Um, we have 13 grandchildren, but it was the most enjoyable thing. Um, your grandfather had never traveled really. He'd like been up the East Coast a little bit. He'd been to New York for sports games, but that was about it. And he had a brother in Colorado, and he hadn't seen him in 9 years. And I said, "That's ridiculous." I was going to visit my friend in Florida, and so I bought him a ticket to Colorado. He got on a plane for the first time and went to Colorado, and it was just like his other brother was there at the time, so the three brothers were together, and it was magical. I have to say, like, it's not to say that we didn't have bad times because he became disabled shortly after we were together. He'd worked as a bricklayer for many years. And then he was working at Brown as a groundskeeper, and we were at a graduation party for one of his nephews, and all of a sudden, we were driving back from New Hampshire, and his hands blew up, and he couldn't close his hands, and we went right to the hospital, and he had this weird disease that they couldn't really diagnose. Took a lot of doctors, but we made it through. We made it through all of those things. He couldn't work anymore, and so that was a difficult time for him to get through. Um, but we always found time. The family supported us, and he came, with three sisters and two brothers. I had one brother who lived in New York, and I didn't have much, so he gave me a bigger family. I mean, I had lots of cousins and all of that I was close with when I was younger, but had gotten distance from as time goes on, as you do, when you get your own family. But your grandfather was the love of my life, and we just had an amazing life. Lots of ups and downs, but through it all, we just trusted each other and supported each other and gave to each other. Um, he was just a magical person. He was a person who didn't have very high esteem when he first started out, and he learned to overcome that. He had a learning disability that I mean, he as a child and nobody paid attention to it, and as an adult, always felt less than until um, when he had when he developed this medical condition. We discovered all these other things. He was dyslexic, and he had ADD, and he just had all these things, and so he wasn't given the kinds of services that are available now. And that's one thing I will say, that the services that are available for folks who have ADD or dyslexia or some kind of learning disability are so much better, and can make a difference in their lives. But got to take advantage of them. And he didn't have that opportunity. And then he learned. He learned as an adult. to compensate. And he was happy in his life, and I was happy in my life with him.
Yeah, it seems like you guys got a almost like a second chance at life. It was just reborn, and
It really was, and it happened around the time I was 37. So that was my like this, I was, my life went the way it was supposed to, like in quotes, kind of supposed to. You go to school, you get married, you have children, you get a job, all that kind of stuff was what we were supposed to be doing. And then I got to do all this other stuff. My dad traveled with me. We traveled to all kinds of places. He humored me because I like to go to odd places. And so we did some really unusual things on our travels. We didn't go to the typical places that people went. We explored, we met incredible people on those journeys because we looked for people who live there. Our last trip was Alaska, and he didn't want to go. Um, well, I should say, for his 50th birthday, we made a birthday party for him. And it was all his friends were there, and they got him so drunk that he had no memory whatsoever of that party. So I said, that will never happen again. When he was 60, we went to Ireland for his birthday, and that's where his roots were. And he had the time of his life. Now, my son came also, my son Gregory, and he mostly kind of like went along with me because we had different interests, and we got to explore both our interests, but we always came back together again. So he went out to all the pubs. We were in one town, and they had 12 pubs, and they had this little map with all the 12 pubs on it. And so he and two women from New Zealand and a guy and a woman from Australia went out to try to hit all the pubs in the town. They came back with 13 signatures. And what we figured out was they wandered into somebody's house. And Irish people are so welcoming that they just took them in and gave them drinks and kind of like wished them well on their journey. And so that was a trip to remember. And then the last one was Alaska, which was a birthday present for me. Something I always wanted to do, and my son kind of set it up, and Jim did not want to go. Looking back, maybe he was beginning to feel some of the effects of the cancer that was eating away at him, but we didn't know he had the cancer. And he just didn't want to go. And I said, well, I'm not going to go without you. And, I really think you should come with me. But if you don't want to go, then we just won't go. But he finally gave in, and he went. And it was the best trip of his life, in a sense, because we were able to set up a tour that allowed us to pick some of the places we went, as long as the other people that were on the tour company had stopped their tours, but we had called, and another 3 women had called, and they had said they were interested in too. And so the guy said, well, there's 7 of you. He said, I'll put something together for you, and here's the itinerary we'd like to do. And I said, well, there's a couple of places I'd like to go that aren't on the itinerary. He said, if you can get the other people to agree to it, fine, they'll take you wherever you want to go. So we went to Alaska. We spent a couple of days on our own looking at things, and then the trip started. The thing started. So we met the tour driver, and the interesting thing about that was he was telling us a little bit about himself, and he said he worked as a rehabilitation counselor. Now, rehabilitation counseling at that time, and still is, a very small occupation. There aren't a lot of people that do it. And so I was like, oh, I worked in rehabilitation too. I'm a rehabilitation counselor too. And so he went, oh, turned around to the people. I said, I hope you don't mind, but I need to take Susan to my office. I have to introduce her to the other people in my office. And that started it. But he was so wonderful on that trip because he had an understanding of disability. So Jim was a little limited sometimes in walking, and he was worried about the cold. When we got to places that had a lot of walking, the guy would drive the bus a little place. He'd stop. He'd get off with his camera, take pictures. He'd come back, he'd sit with Jim and show him all the things that were there. So it turned what could have been a bad experience into a wonderful experience. And those three women that were on the trip with us, two of them were emergency room nurses, and one was an artist and had taught art in school. So it just like fitted. So it was just like perfect coming together of people. It was meant to be. And we got to see some wonderful things. And like one day we were supposed to be going somewhere, and I noticed a street fair, and I said, "Street fair. We should go to the street fair." And we went to the street fair. So it again happenstance, but also some planning too. But we got to do the things we wanted to do, and it was just a joyful experience. And we didn't know at the time it was going to be the last big trip we took, but it was.
Yeah, and just being able to travel travel together and experience so many beautiful things that this world and this country have to
Yeah.
offer is you can't take those memories away. Like it's
No.
forever. It's one of those things that we kind of talked about throughout the podcast about like not chasing the money and just doing things because you love to do them and you enjoy to do them. Obviously, have a career to make money because you need to support yourself, and that's just the way that being adult works
Mhm.
nowadays. You have to do these things, but enjoy life. Like take time off, enjoy things with the people that you love, and I think that's your entire life story, especially with my grandfather and you guys together. You really embodied that to travel, to do things, to open the business, to work on it together, like doing things together, but also enjoying things and like celebrating the other person for what they like to enjoy.
Contributed, and it was respect, and I think that's important. Respect, and as I said, finding that kernel, that that flame inside of a person, and helping to fan it. I think is important, and to always look for the worth in people. I think that's what I would say is like really really important. That because everybody, there are so many we don't know other people's stories.
Yeah, and that's kind of the journey I've been on with this podcast
Yeah.
is um, just being willing to sit down with people and ask the questions and have the conversation. And I always say, I mean, it's even in the description of this podcast. It's everyone has a story essentially, and it's just interviewing people, everyday people that do different things, and you never know what you're going to uncover when you talk to someone. And every new episode opens up a new episode in the
Mhm.
future because someone listened to the conversation and enjoyed the conversation. And I think this has been one of those things that I didn't know was going to give me so much purpose. And as someone who I like to think I'm pretty introverted, I don't like to do all that stuff outside, but this has always been the place for me lately where I could just kind of detach from everything, sit down with a person, ask the conversations, and try my best to showcase it to everyone online. And hopefully they enjoy it, and the people of the family and friends of that person enjoy the
Mhm.
conversation. And I'm just trying to live up to that and do that every single episode and for as long as I can. Because there'll be a day where you kind of mentioned too with the art where you just didn't feel with joy anymore, and it's okay to stop when you don't feel that. And I think that's a perfect place where we can start bringing this home.
I do want to say one thing,
Yeah, I
and that
have two more. I
okay,
have a
okay,
question, but if you want
okay.
to do
One of
that.
these, I want to say how proud I am of you. I've always been proud of you, going way, way back when you were little. But and your grandfather was so proud of you. And I've listened to the podcasts, and I don't listen to every single one of them, but I've listened to a number of them, and I'm so proud of the way that you do bring out people, and everybody has a message, and everybody has something important to say, and you find it, and there's struggles in every life, and we some people persevere and some don't, but it's nice to know um, what the people did to persevere.
Thank you. Yeah, and I try my best in creating a space that's where people feel comfortable enough to share, because obviously there's certain stuff that people might not want to share on the internet, and we don't go into that. But for I would say for most people, they do dive into a lot of stuff that's pretty personal. I've had people cry, and I've had people like really get into stuff that they've never even told people, and
Mhm.
it's cool that people feel willing to do that with me. So again, I appreciate you for even doing this, and having the chance to kind of document your life story a little bit and to go into some different things and get your thoughts and opinions out there. I think it's important. As we do come to the end, I do have my last question that I ask everyone. If you can, when you answer this, just lean in a little bit too. I want to make sure it's like perfect. Um, and that question is, what would your advice be for someone who wants to pursue their passion?
Do it. I think that would be my advice is not to be there's lots of fears around that, but not to let them overcome you. Um, if it doesn't work, then you take a different path. It's not the end of the world. So I really think that you need to do what makes your heart sing.
Perfect. And I think that's the perfect place to wrap the podcast. And I appreciate you for inviting me to your home. We're gonna hang out for a little bit, have dinner, and but just glad that we've been able to sit down and talk on this podcast. It's over an hour and probably one of my longer episodes, and I wanted to dedicate the right amount of time to obviously we didn't touch upon everything,
No.
but I think it's important to touch on the things that we did touch on. And again, I just appreciate you and I love you for being willing to do this and sit with me and encourage me to keep on doing this. So again, thank you.
And I love you too.
For you guys like the podcast, please rate, review, subscribe, share with your friends, share with your family, share with your grandma. Check it out at thecarrollconnection.simplecast.com. Also, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major listening platforms. If you like to watch your podcast, go on YouTube, search The Carroll Connection or at Jared M. Carroll, and it should pop up. And if you want to be a guest or return as a guest, hit me up on Instagram at Jared M. Carroll, at The Carroll Connection, and we'll set that up. Till next time, guys. Peace.